My name is John West. I am an Associate Director of the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute and Vice President for Public Policy and Legal Affairs. Discovery was founded in 1992 as a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational research organization with programs today on things like science and culture, transportation and regionalism, technology and democracy, bioethics, religion and public life, American-Russian relations, and much more. I encourage you to find out more about us on our website, www.discovery.org. But now to this afternoon's topic. For thousands of years, human beings have debated and investigated whether there's evidence in nature to show that nature is the product of design rather than chance and necessity. The ancient Greeks debated this question, with Plato and Socrates arguing for design and Democritus, Leucippus, and Epicurus arguing the negative. In Roman times, the debate raged between the Stoics and the materialist Lucretius. At the time of Darwin, the co-founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection, Alfred Wallace, disagreed with his friend Darwin about whether there was evidence for design in nature. He thought there was. Darwin didn't. For the past decade or more, the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery has been at the forefront of the modern debate over intelligent design in the sciences. We support the academic work of scientists and philosophers of sciences who are making the scientific case for design based on logic, probability theory, and empirical evidence. Now, although intelligent design is a scientific endeavor, it certainly has implications for many other areas of culture, including religion. So in addition to supporting the work of scholars who are developing the science of intelligent design, we also support scholars who explore the cultural ramifications of the Darwin ID debate. It's important to point out that we're not the only ones who recognize that there are broader cultural implications of the debate between Darwinism and design. Darwinists repeatedly make this point, from Richard Dawkins, who insists that Darwinism has made it possible for us to become intellectually fulfilled atheists, to the National Center for Science Education, which has even developed a curriculum for churches on how evolution can expand their views of God, and has even used taxpayer funds, you may not know this, but that to develop a website to teach teachers how to convince students that the proper religious view of evolution is that evolution and religion, support each other, or that religion should support Darwinian evolution, and that's the proper view you should have as a religious person, paid for by your tax dollars. Earlier this year, meanwhile, a group calling itself the International Society for Science and Religion released a statement denouncing intelligent design as bad theology. Well, if Darwinists can talk all the time about the theological and cultural implications of both Darwinism and ID, certainly we should be allowed to participate in that conversation as well. And so that's really the subject for this afternoon. And we are delighted to be able to have one of our longtime CSC fellows, Jack Collins, here to talk on this subject. And to introduce Dr. Collins, I'm now going to introduce Dr. Bruce Gordon, who is the research director here at the Center for Science and Culture. Dr. Gordon will introduce Dr. Collins.
Okay, terrific. Thanks, John. So, our speaker today started off not in biblical studies, but in engineering at MIT. He has a bachelor's and a master's degree in signal processing and systems engineering, so that makes him well positioned to understand intelligent design. Engineers try to get physical systems to perform complicated tasks, and anyone who's ever tried to do that realizes how difficult it is, and intelligent design being the theory that certain features of the universe and of living systems are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than an undirected natural process, seems like a natural fit, that an engineer would be able to regard nature through that lens. Anyway, after his engineering training, he switched gears completely, went on and did a Master of Divinity at Faith Evangelical Lutheran Seminary down in Tacoma, and then on to the University of Liverpool to do a PhD in Hebrew linguistics. So he's well situated to analyze whether intelligent design is bad theology, as some have been claiming. So let me turn things over to Jack. Please join me in welcoming him. Lest I forget, Jack is the author of 3 books. The God of Miracles, one on science and faith. He has them, all 3 here. Unfortunately, we've only got this one on science and faith for sale. I think there are 8 copies left, and he's available to sign them, I presume.
I will.
After the talk. So, Jack Collins.
Well, it is a treat to be with you this afternoon and to have an opportunity to reflect about these sorts of questions. Is intelligent design bad theology? Now, the project of intelligent design has all manner of critics. I suppose everyone here is fully aware of that. Most of what comes to us as the general public comes from those who criticize intelligent design as bad science, or not even science at all. A number of recent statements, and Dr. Gordon and Dr. West have mentioned them, a number of recent statements have also argued that it's bad theology. For example, Michal Heller, who is a priest and a professor at the Pontifical Academy of Theology in Krakow, Poland, and he also received the Templeton Prize in 2008. And then, as was mentioned, the International Society for Science and Religion published a statement just recently, and both of these have denounced intelligent design as bad theology. This second group, the International Society for Science and Religion, appeals to an English theologian by the name of Simon Barrow, a man with an evangelical background, who has written a theological commentary in support both of Heller and of the ISSR. I could multiply examples, but these will be representative, and I'll use these as conversation partners this afternoon. Now, this is especially striking since we're accustomed to the claim that intelligent design gets all of its impetus from religious motivations. If anyone could show, so the thinking goes, that those religious motivations are actually contrary to good theology, then of course that must drain all the fuel for promoting it. That's the reasoning, I think, but I'm not saying that I'm agreeing with it. Well, how would we be able to assess claims like that? Well, it seems to me that the very first step is just to get some clear definitions. What is intelligent design, and what is good or bad theology? And who gets to say what they are? I'm sure that there are ways to define these things in such a way that we would all answer, of course, intelligent design is bad theology. But it need not follow that every definition of intelligent design must be contrary to every definition of good theology. And once we've got those definitions straight, then we can begin to think about our overall question, is intelligent design bad theology? You've heard a little bit about me already. I've always loved the sciences. I've especially loved language and animals, and have always wanted to pursue the study of those things further. And in God's good providence, only languages has been the avenue available to me. I did work for engineering consulting firms for several years after I finished my education at MIT, before studying for seminary and also working as a pastor in Spokane before beginning to teach at Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis back in 1993. I'm a clergyman in a theologically traditional Presbyterian church body, and the seminary at which I teach is our denominational seminary. It's not my intention here to be sectarian, but I'll let you be the judge of that. All right, then let's start with some definitions. First, what is intelligent design? Now, there are several definitions of intelligent design out there, and they don't all agree. For example, a press release from the American Academy for the Advancement of Science puts it this way: intelligent design consists of 2 hypothetical claims about the history of the universe and of life. First, that some structures or processes in nature are irreducibly complex and could not have originated through small changes over long periods of time. And second, that some structures or processes in nature are expressions of complex specified information that can only be the product of intelligent design. They continue, intelligent design necessarily presupposes that there is an intelligent designer outside of nature who, from the beginning or from time to time, inserts design into the world around us. Simon Barrow, in the essay that I've mentioned, describes intelligent design by way of its contrast to his own thinking. He says intelligent design is based on faulty conceptions of the relation of God to the world, ones that essentially follow from what was previously termed the God of the gaps, the proposal that divine activity occurs in spaces, limits, and boundaries allegedly arising from the natural order. Ironically, he says, this attempt to specify an interventionist role for God ends up confining the divine to those parts of the scientific enterprise where we are presently, but not necessarily terminally, uninformed. He objects then to the what he sees to be bound up with intelligent design, namely that if you say this is designed, you're saying God did this, and if you're saying this isn't designed, you're saying God didn't do that. We'll come back to that shortly. However, these are the opponents of intelligent design. What do its proponents think they're doing? Stephen Meyer, who works here at the Discovery Institute, describes it this way. Contrary to media reports, intelligent design is not a religious-based idea, but instead an evidence-based scientific theory about life's origins, one that challenges strictly materialistic views of evolution. The theory of intelligent design holds that there are telltale features of living systems and the universe that are best explained by a designing intelligence. No surprise, the Discovery Institute has an official definition that is quite similar to that. The theory of intelligent design holds that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection. In my own writing, I have argued that there are two kinds of design. First, there's what you might call design of properties, which is what happens when you produce a material that has properties that will serve some purpose. An example would be steel or plastic. These things have properties for the particular purposes for which they're designed. The second kind of design is imposed design, which is what happens when structure is imposed upon some object or collection of objects for some purpose. And the key thing is that the structure and the purpose do not arise from the properties of the objects, but they use those properties. Let me give you some examples from everyday life so you have an idea of what I'm thinking here. I've mentioned steel and plastic as examples of design of properties. A digital watch here is an example of designed properties, the semiconductors and the various materials that are put together here, but it's also imposed design because somebody took these materials and arranged them in a particular structure so that it does a particular activity. It tells time. And the telling of time and the structure is not a product of the properties of the semiconductor, the plastic, and the bits of metal and so forth. Somebody imposed that on those things. It doesn't violate those properties, it uses them for a purpose. Another example would be Stonehenge. Stonehenge, that magnificent monument in rural England, these stones that are in some disrepair nowadays, is an example of imposed design. Nobody thinks that those stones just got moved there by some combination of wind and weather and seismic activity and so forth. Nobody thinks that they were arranged in that circular arrangement simply by chance. Everybody recognizes that somebody imposed that structure on those stones for some purpose, even if nobody knows what the purpose is. You can still say that thing must have been designed, even though I don't know what it was designed for. Well, discussions of what's called the anthropic principle in cosmology often conclude that the universe is finely tuned to support life. The fundamental constants in physics, for example, don't have any room for variation if we're to be alive right here and right now on this planet. The universe on a big scale would be an example of designed properties. It has properties that are designed for the purpose of supporting our lives. So from this angle, the intelligent design program says it's legitimate as well to have as part of our toolkit for scientific explanations for natural things the option to say that in addition to designed properties, they may contain instances of imposed design. So it's not a case of either or, it's a case of both and. Well now, if you put it that way, you can see that intelligent design is not necessarily a theological program at all, at least not in its basic questions. Of course, it may have theological implications, but as a matter of fact, so does the denial that there is any validity to intelligent design. Neither of them is religiously neutral. The real issue becomes one of which scheme does a better job of accounting for what we actually encounter in the world. All right, so if that's what intelligent design is, then secondly, what is theology? Very, very broadly, you could say that theology is the effort to say something about ultimate realities. But that's not very interesting, and it's not really going to help us very much in deciding whether something is good or bad theology. I should think it more informative to say that theology works within a particular religious community, and it aims to serve the well-being of that community by making normative statements about what is divine and what bearing the divine has on the life of the community and on the individual lives of the members of the community. Perhaps it will also say something about those who aren't members. So the basic function of theology is to shape the worldview of the members of that particular religious community, to enable them to lean into the world properly. Traditionally, or at least in the West, and I would include broadly Judaism, Plato and Aristotle, Christianity, and those Islamic scholars with which I've had contact, traditionally these theologians value intellectual rigor in order to say true things about the divine and about its relation to the world. So the question of good or bad theology cannot be answered in a vacuum. The International Society for Science and Religion, for example, in their statement asserts that in many religious traditions, such as some found in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, the notion of intelligent design is irrelevant. Well, the only reply that we can give to that is, so what? The notion of intelligent design may be irrelevant to that particular part of that particular religion, but that hardly says anything about whether it's a good way of describing the world that we actually encounter. I don't see how the religious irrelevance can lead to the assertion that it is bad theology. And even if you could show that it is irrelevant to Christian theology, the same objection applies, the same response of so what? If it's a good way of describing the world, then it's a good way of describing the world, and the religious tradition has to live with that. Further, other religions, besides these that they mention, Hinduism, these parts of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, other religions might have an interest in intelligent design, and they might find it theologically interesting. Well, the theological critics that I have mentioned, Michal Heller and Simon Barrow, both claim to work within Christianity, as I do. But the question we have to ask is whether they speak for Christianity as a whole. And how do I decide to believe what they say? We need criteria for Christian theology, or more widely, for the theology of communities that accept the Hebrew Bible as a part of their canon. Well, here's what occurs to me as the list of features of good theology for communities like that. First of all, good theology must seek to cooperate with divine revelation, particularly in the Holy Book. And the book of Genesis will be a part of the Holy Book for Jews and Christians. There will be different views of what that cooperation is going to look like. Whether you consider the New Testament to be a part of the canon or not, what role you think church tradition is to play, or rabbinic tradition, or whatever. And so there will be different views, but the theologians will want to show that they are at least doing justice to the revelation. Secondly, good theology will find a basic worldview in the revelation and use that worldview as a touchstone as it extends theological reflection beyond those basic points. I'll come back to that shortly. Thirdly, good theology aims to be intellectually responsible. It's going to try to use good arguments in order to say true things. Fourth, good theology respects the tradition of theological thought. Now, different communities will take different perspectives on just what this respect should look like. Roman Catholics will differ from Presbyterians, and they will differ from Greek Orthodox, and so on and so forth. Most of these communities that I'm aware of allow for some kind of theological development, so we're not talking about theology getting to a static point and staying there. But we ought to be aware of where we stand in relation to our forebears and to acknowledge our debts to them and, if need be, our differences with them. Finally, good theology ministers to the life of the community that it serves, and preferably to the wider communities, to those outside of the specific community that the good theology will serve. So that's an idea then of what is good theology, and let me then take up the question of what is the basic worldview of Jewish and Christian belief. I've said that good theology will find a basic worldview in the Revelation and use that worldview as a touchstone. So let me apply these criteria and see if they lead to any conclusions about whether intelligent design is good or bad theology. The specific topic that I want us to think about is God's relationship to the world. Now, Simon Barrow tells us that in Christian thought, God achieves his purposes in the world through what he calls a persuasive and loving engagement with everything in the universe, rather than a prescriptive engineering of bits of it to produce specific outcomes. He insists that intelligent design advocates seek to show on forensic grounds that evolved aspects of the natural order, which Christian theology, he says, speaks of as a gift to which God is committed, cannot be self-supporting and therefore needs supplementing by discrete acts of extraterrestrial supervening, posited in localized and concrete ways. Further, he says that God is the wholly unconditioned source, flow, and destiny of all being and becoming. Ponder that for a while. If you're sure you know what that means, help me later. A very different notion, he says, from intelligent design and central to the developed monotheistic traditions. Further, continuing with him, a well-construed theological account of the world as God's good creation is instantly in conflict with proposals that seek to specify what is and is not of God, that requires some kind of magical theory, or that seeks to baptize lack of human knowledge as the presence of the divine. He says that intelligent design is a construct based on discredited ideas about biblical texts, a misunderstanding of the idea of creation, which is an understanding of the world process as gift, not a theory of origins in competition with evolution, and a God of the gaps approach rejected by serious theologians. Finally, he tells us that Genesis has not one but two creation stories. They differ widely in detail, are highly figurative, and were written to combat fatalistic ancient Near East cosmologies by stressing the underlying goodness of the creation as a gift of God. Father Heller is briefer. He tells us quite simply that science gives us knowledge and religion gives us meaning. Well, all right, how do these assertions then square with the criteria for good theology? First, let me say something about Genesis. I have been studying the book of Genesis, especially the early chapters of it, for a number of years. And I have written a commentary on it, on the first 4 chapters of Genesis, and I have a more popular presentation of many of my ideas in the book on science and faith. And in my commentary, I've argued primarily on grounds based on the grammar of the Hebrew that it's a mistake to say that there are 2 creation accounts in Genesis. The allusion that Simon Barrow is making is to the idea that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are separate creation accounts which tell the creation story differently. And I have argued that that's actually a mistake. The so-called second creation account, which is Genesis chapter 2, is really an elaboration of the 6th creation day of Genesis chapter 1. Again, if you want the full story in that, I'll refer you to things that I have written. And I would agree with Simon Barrow, as a matter of fact, that there are figurative elements in this whole story, and that Genesis 1 and 2 are, in fact, deliberately set over against cosmologies from the ancient Near East, particularly those from Mesopotamia, the ancient Babylonians, and so forth. But saying that hardly entails that Genesis has no intent to narrate actual events. One can narrate, after all, events using figurative elements. As a matter of fact, the other ancient Near Eastern stories actually set out to recount what their tellers thought was history. We call them myths primarily today because we don't believe them. But from within their own perspective, they didn't think of them that way at all. And there's a discussion of that in my commentary on Genesis 1 through 4, and I refer to Kenneth Kitchen, an Egyptologist and an expert in the ancient Near East. He has a book called The Reliability of the Old Testament, and he points out that The tendency in these other creation stories in the ancient Near East was to tell what the authors thought were a true narrative and to invest them with theological significance by using elements that invoked their deities and so forth. And so if Genesis is set over against those, then we ought to conclude that that is its purpose as well. Well, Genesis, like these other stories, sets out to be the front end of the worldview story of ancient Israel. Jews and Christians have perhaps at times taken its details more literally than they should have done, but they have rightly inferred from this text the basic elements of a biblical worldview and have gone on to extend that into a sophisticated and robust metaphysic. The basic worldview story is this, and it's okay to quote from myself, isn't it, in my book on science and faith. Here's how I describe it. It is a wise, good, and powerful creator who made the world by the word of his power. God made mankind to be his friends and to display his own character. God will call all mankind to account for their response to God's purpose. And even though mankind is sinful by the corruption of their wills, God still pursues them with the offer of forgiveness, moral renewal, and friendship. God inspired the Bible as his special word to man, and therefore the Bible is able to speak truly about the world that God made. Well, this claim that the world came from a good and wise creator who made a good world for us to live in and to enjoy and to rule lays a firm foundation for all good science and philosophy, as I argue in my commentary on Genesis 1-4. I said there that God made man to have dominion over the world, which at first meant to rule it in wisdom and generosity like God's own. To manage the world this way, man must be able to know its properties in order to use them to the best advantage. Our senses and intelligence allow us to say things about the world that are true, things we have learned by experience. They also allow us to admire and to extol its beauty. God has made man and the world for each other. In other words, all the components necessary for good science follow from seeing the world as God's creation. And a very simple statement of the implication of Genesis would be, as I've argued again in my commentary, and I could develop this more fully, but I won't for the sake of time, is this. To begin with, we find the assertion that the universe does not exist on its own. It had a beginning which resulted from the creative work of God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Further, the world did not organize itself. It took God's special activity to shape the earth into a place for mankind to live, to populate it with plants and animals, and to bring man into being. We see this special activity in the presence of the Spirit of God in chapter 1 and verse 2 of Genesis. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And also in the repeated, "and God said," followed by the fulfillment of what God wished to be so. And then in the divine consultation in the making of man, when God said, "Let us make man." Metaphysically, we may refer to this as supernatural. That is, God made the world, endowing its parts with natural properties, or causal powers, if you like, that he maintains in existence. And he may at any time bring about something that goes beyond the natural causal powers of his creatures. The Spirit and the Word add something to the natures of the things that they operate on. The literary reading of Genesis 1:1-2:3 that I developed in my commentary shows why it's unlikely that the author has made a strong claim for the sequence of events. Okay, we're taking account of figurative elements here. And it also reminds us very little that he says very little about the actual processes that produced the effects. And when we combine this with the literary milieu of ancient creation accounts, we find confirmation for that reticence. On the other hand, the metaphysical claim is inescapable. Well, these conclusions that I have drawn are, for the most part, fairly traditional for Jewish and Christian theology. And they show why these faiths have used public events as their principal appeal. Ancient Israel defined themselves as the people that the Creator God had brought out of Egypt, and to whom God gave the law of Moses, and for whom God raised up the dynasty of David to be their king. The early Christians said that the same God who did all those things also raised Jesus from the dead, and they invited refutation. So they would not accept what Father Heller says, that science gives us facts and religion gives us meaning. because they would have said that the true religion is based on these factual statements. So that leads me then into my third question. Does intelligent design conflict with traditional theology? If we use the definition of intelligent design given by its theological critics, I guess we would have to conclude that intelligent design is in conflict not only with their version of Christian theology, but with traditional Genesis-based theology. Specifically, these critics fear that intelligent design allows us to say God did this because it's designed, and God did not do this because it is not designed. But there is no reason to accept that way of thinking about design. The traditional metaphysic that I've spoken of makes room for both design of properties and imposed design. And it calls both of them God's doing. And further, while it may be true that some people appeal to areas of ignorance for their assertions of imposed design, they may say things like, I do not know how such a structure could have developed simply as a result of designed properties. The leading design theorists have taken pains to establish their claims of imposed design on extensive knowledge. The more we know, for example, about the details of this or that, say the way that DNA works, the more clear it becomes that this system could not have arisen as a result simply of designed properties. So they're making a different kind of statement than I know not how it could have, but they're trying to argue that it could not have arisen in this way. That is, the charge that all design reasoning is God of the gaps misunderstands the nature of that reasoning. You see, let's talk about the God of the gaps question. There are gaps and then there are gaps. There are gaps in our knowledge, things that we don't know how they happened. And a good design inference is careful not to rely on these. But there are also gaps between the properties of the components of some designed element that we may see, for example, the properties of the components of this digital watch, and the structure that we see, the arrangement. There's a gap between the properties of these components and the actual arrangement into a watch that tells time. In this case, we're confident that ever more detailed knowledge of the components is only going to increase our sense of imposed design. So I'll leave it for the design theorists to talk about DNA and other features of living creatures and of the universe and so forth. That's not my brief this afternoon. But the best of them have made arguments then based on these gaps in the properties. So many theologians who criticize intelligent design are of the opinion that a truly good creation will have no gaps for God to fill. But as a matter of fact, that is not what the word good means in the creation account. You remember in Genesis chapter 1, God keeps seeing things that they're good, and then when he's finished, at the end of Genesis chapter 1, he looked at all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. In that account, good means that what God made is well suited to its assigned purpose, which is to be a stable environment in which rational agents can make their choices and live their lives. There's no reason under this way of thinking to suppose that God has left no traces of his craftsmanship in this magnificent work that the creation is. No traces of his craftsmanship or of the process that produced such a breathtaking achievement. And just as it's possible to define design in such a way as to make it objectionable, it's also possible to posit a theological system that rejects any idea of finding imposed design out of hand a priori, before you even get started. That theological system that we might wish to posit, however, is not traditional Judaism or Christianity. Further, adherents of traditional Judaism and Christian theology will agree with the sentiments of the Christian philosopher Paul Helm, who said, "It is not appropriate to argue a priori what God will and will not do with and in the physical creation, but, as with any contingent matter of fact, it is necessary to investigate what God has done." So to rule some things out ahead of time, as the theological critics of intelligent design want to do, seems not only pointless, but even theologically improper. Now, it's controversial, even amongst traditional Jews and Christians, just what role cases of imposed design might have in their task of apologetics, the task of commending their beliefs to people with theological questions, intellectual questions. One common objection to this endeavor is that no proof of a designed universe, that is to say with life being the product of imposed design, gets you to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, still less to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I believe that this point is a valid one, but it hardly serves as an argument against the reality of intelligent design, nor does it even dismiss intelligent design from the toolbox of the apologist. Now, my car is a very fine machine, but it cannot get me to the moon. That does not make my car useless. After all, my car can get me to Cape Canaveral, where I could catch a flight to the moon, I suppose, if I could pass all the fitness tests. So this only serves as a caution about making too grandiose claims for intelligent design, but not an argument against it. I'm also well aware that design arguments do not convince everyone. But you see, in traditional theology, there's a distinction between reasoning and reasoners. The reasoning may be valid, but the reasoners won't follow it. Reasoners are human beings with complex motives and a variety of aspirations. And again, this failure, if you want to call it that, is not necessarily a failure in the reasoning process itself. Actually, the theological value of intelligent design does not rest only on its ability to convince skeptics, as useful as that may be at times. The famous book Natural Theology came from the pen of William Paley, and he noted that if believers, he was actually a parson in a country parish when he wrote that book, and even though he may have written it for an educated audience, he was certainly thinking of the rural people that he served. He noted that if believers could make the recognition of pervasive design what he called the ruling habitual sentiment of our minds, this would make the world a temple and life itself one continued act of adoration. In other words, recognizing intelligent design feeds the faith of believers, and it steels their moral nerve by reinforcing their sense of being here as a result of God's own purpose. And this is needful. There are all manner of challenges to this sense of purpose. Finally, I want to say that apparent imposed design is a part of the data that we actually confront in the world. We're perhaps all familiar with how Richard Dawkins has described biology. He says it is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And there are certainly many who agree with Dawkins who think that the task of the scientist in general is to remove that appearance. Now, Dawkins is acknowledging that apparent imposed design is a part of the data that we encounter in nature. And I think that G.K. Chesterton, writing in 1925, identified three areas in which Dawkins' ideal biologist will fail to remove the appearance of design. Here's what he said: "No philosopher denies that a mystery still attaches to the two great transitions, the origin of the universe itself and the origin of the principle of life itself. Most philosophers have the enlightenment to add that a third mystery attaches to the origin of man himself. In other words, a third bridge was built across a third abyss of the unthinkable, when there came into the world what we call reason and what we call will." These three bridges across the abyss of the unthinkable, to use Chesterton's words, seem to be well-established cases of imposed design. The stunning fact that there is something rather than nothing in the universe. The marvelous language system that lies behind the way that DNA works in your own cells. And this curious combination in human beings of reason and language, moral experience, artistic sensibility, relationships governed by love and commitment. All of these we find in human beings and in no other animal. These are data. And we didn't actually need Genesis to help us to see them. What Genesis does do is put them into a coherent framework. The reason these things are so is because God made them that way, so that we could enjoy His world and serve one another, and so that He could enjoy our company. So intelligent design takes an ordinary human experience, inferring imposed design, and uses it as a part of the process of critical thinking about the world that we encounter. Well, if you put it that way, you can see that intelligent design at its best, anyhow, is just rationality applied to the astonishing variety of things that we find in this endlessly fascinating world. And that, I think you can see, is always good theology. One trouble with inferring design, however, is that it confronts us with ultimate questions. If the world was designed, what was it designed for? And if we were designed, what were we designed for? Well, the world might not tell us the answer to those questions, but it does make it hard for us to keep avoiding those questions. As I was thinking about this talk and reading what the theologians have said, and there's a lot more than what I've mentioned this afternoon, I went upstairs in my house and my daughter was home from school, and I asked her a question. She's just finished her junior year of high school. She's an outstanding science student at her particular high school, got a 5 on her AP chemistry exam last year, and so on and so forth. And I simply asked her, is intelligent design bad theology? And she replied, no. And so I said to her, why not? And she said to me, well, because it makes sense of what we know about the world. Well, what can I add to that? Thank you.
Okay, we have time for some questions for the next 20 minutes or so. So let's open the floor. Yes, let me bring the mic back to you so that we can hear what you have to say.
In chapter 2 of Genesis, it gives the King James used the word created, and the New American Version was had created. Is there a past perfect tense in the Hebrew to help explain that?
You're talking about Genesis 2 and verse 19. That's right. Actually, formed is the word. And one of my former colleagues here, Phil Long, who teaches at Regent College, can remember back that was in the early 90s, in the very early days of my career at Covenant Seminary. That was one of my first big projects, was to discuss the grammar that you find there in Genesis 2 and verse 19. And I think Dr. Long was happy that in the course of that, I vindicated one of the key arguments in his own doctoral thesis, which was a few years before mine. And so, of course, he thinks that my argument was sound. And if you will see in there is an update of the English Standard Version that should be available now. It is translated as the Lord God had formed there in Genesis 2 and verse 19. And that, I believe, is the right translation. And I give some of the grammatical arguments here in this commentary.
I always thought that faith was important, and that, either there's all this proof of God, which
right.
There's not, or we're trying hard to find some proof of God, where faith says we're not supposed to have to try to find it, we're supposed to have faith. And I don't understand
right.
where that fits in if it's so hard to figure out if it's intelligent design. To me, it's intelligent design, but it doesn't have to be irreducible complexity. That's one place where I'm having trouble, because that's the God of the gaps. And so what he's saying makes sense to me. In where does faith come into this? If we're supposed to have it, or it doesn't matter. And if it doesn't matter, why isn't God standing in front of us talking to us all?
Well, that's an excellent question. And what you have to do is step back and ask, what do you mean by faith? And what would a biblical author mean in talking about faith? In Webster's dictionary, faith is defined as belief that's in the absence of evidence. And that is not the traditional Christian or Jewish definition of what faith is. Think instead of it as trust, and think of what happens in a relationship. This would be more than 30 years ago. When I was a graduate student in engineering, and I met a young lady who was a new freshman at MIT, and we were getting to know each other. And we eventually decided that we needed to marry each other. And in the relationship, the trust, as it were, extrapolates from the experience, but it doesn't do away with the experience. So it extrapolates, it goes beyond, but it's founded in the experience. And so that's the way trust works. And so Jesus, to his disciples, tells them, if you don't believe my words, believe the works that I've done. He gives them reasons to believe. And so it is true that in terms of any individual person's experience, they may come to faith in different ways. But in terms of the growth of their faith, they will meet challenges to their faith. And then it becomes important to be able to back up their faith, not simply by those reasons. Those can play a role, they have for me, but by thinking about other things, the people that I know, and I mean, there's a variety of reasons that people can use. But the way in which a person not only comes to faith, but survives with strong faith, involves a recognition that their faith is about a reality, namely God, and about His work in the world. And so it involves the reality of things like the Exodus from Egypt, the reality of things for Christians, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and so forth. And sometimes we have doubts, and we have to go back and answer those doubts in order to be intellectually responsible.
In this discussion between science and religion, I find myself much more comfortable with physicists than I do biologists, and I'm wondering why that is. For instance, if we can grant that although the Genesis talks about God created, in fact, a study of the Scripture would suggest that creation is an ongoing process, that God not only did create but continues to create, which, if it's true that that's compatible with the Scripture, for instance, we would say that God created all of us, that God continues to create everything that comes into being. I'm curious, in your own discussions, if you yourself have experienced that physicists who talk about the constant generation of all material existence from a deeper level of reality is not itself compatible with your beliefs as a biblical scholar and theologian, and why we scientists can talk about that at its depths, reality appears to resemble mind more than matter. A number of physicists talk that way. Why, in your experience, do biologists tend to react to any suggestion that that matter depends upon a non-material reality, where physicists don't seem to have, at least many of them, don't seem to have this problem?
Right. That's an excellent question. On the specific about the continuous generation of matter and so forth, I'm just going to back off from that and say I don't know enough physicists to talk intelligently about that particular question. I've heard physicists talk rather about the origin of the universe and the fine-tuning of the constants, the physical constants in the universe and so forth. And amongst them, they're allowed to express their awe at these things. And it's a part of their culture where they're allowed to say that. And at least in my experience. And it's not inapropos to talk about God and even creation from nothing. One of my instructors, Victor Weisskopf, used to talk that way at MIT. Used to speak that way about the origin of the universe and the marvel of the way the universe exists and supports our lives and so forth. So I can only suppose that it's a function of the different cultures. There's several things that are important to remember. One is that the closer you get to what it means to be human, the more opportunity there is for fierce conflict. So as you get to biology, we are biological entities. And so where did we come from has a very strong influence on what you think is the good life now. And then if you move from that into psychology and so forth, the worldview issues, are really a part of the whole discussion that can't be kept out. So that's one factor. Another factor is, this is a comment made by David Alt, who's a professor of geology at University of Montana in Missoula. He has this very, very interesting book on Glacial Lake Missoula and its humongous flood, which is part of the explanation for the terrain of eastern Washington. A great read. But he gives you a history of the process by which scientists, geologists came to agree that the terrain in eastern Washington is the product of a catastrophic flood event from a lake that was trapped by an ice dam around what is now Missoula, Montana. And it's an interesting story, and it's a human story. And he says, the words that he says are, science is done by fallible human beings. And science is a human activity done by fallible human beings. You must always remember that. And so you have to ask, okay, what is the culture of this particular group that dictates what they're allowed and not allowed to say? And how does this culture enforce any rules and so forth? And unfortunately, there does seem to be some kind of enforcement of orthodoxy, especially amongst biologists.
Well, certainly the biologists would not say that. I was a biologist, a professor of biology for 25 years, and the whole point of being objective about your research, about your discussion, is paramount, absolutely paramount. And I've heard people like Jack Eccles, who won the Nobel Prize twice, put down established scientists for not following the precepts of our science.
Right, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to knock biologists whatsoever. Since my daughter wants to be one of them, I consider them an honorable group. However, to me, the question is one of critical thinking, and is critical thinking allowed when it comes to the question of whether origins of all biological entities, whether that must be a purely natural process from beginning to end. And when you see various teachers' organizations for biology teachers demanding that that's the way you describe it, then and they're even discouraging critical thinking, that troubles me. I believe that most of biology is good science, and I'm not at all interested in knocking the biologists or anything like that. But what we must require is that it be good science, and therefore that it involve critical thinking, and therefore that questions be allowed. What needs to be true for this to be a good theory and for this to be a satisfactory explanation? And in the biology textbooks, those kinds of questions are not allowed to be raised.
That you must do to have a good scientific theory, and that is you need to be able to interpolate, and you need to be able to extrapolate. You need to be able to say things like, if I do this in an animal, almost identical things would happen in a human being. It's called medical research, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
All medical research is predicated on evolution. All of it. 100%. If it doesn't work in an animal, then we're pretty sure it's not going to work in a human.
How are you defining evolution? We have a neuroscientist, for instance, who is a part of the Discovery Institute, a fellow, who emphatically denies that neo-Darwinian processes are relevant to the understanding of how the human body functions, that one can perfectly well understand the human body and study it from the standpoint of design. Granted that certain things like antibiotic resistance involve some minor adaptations.
I agree that there must have been a supernatural being that made all this. There must have been. And if you want to call that intelligent design, then I'm willing to say there is validity to intelligent design. And I think the vast number of my colleagues would say the same thing. No question about it.
Okay. It's a good question, though, and there's room for more discussion. But this lady right here was about to ask a question earlier, so I'm going to turn the microphone over to her.
My question is based on your understanding of the Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
I went to I heard someone named Faulkner give a discussion on cosmology, and he said something, and my notes aren't quite, I don't know if I got my notes right, but I believe he said in the Hebrew language, when it's history, it's verb, subject, object, and when it's poetry, it's subject, verb, object, and that Genesis was verb, subject, object. And my notes aren't real clear, and I'm wondering if I got that right.
Well, you did. It sounds like a claim that somebody would make, but it's thoroughly inadequate for the kind of material that you have in the first couple of chapters of Genesis. The history versus poetry opposition is not at all useful because you have, for example, Psalms that are clearly poetry, but they recount events like the plagues in Egypt and so forth, so that we can't make that opposition. You can talk about historical events with poetical structures. The specifics of the first chapter of Genesis, the specific style should be called exalted prose narrative. And it's sort of a midway point between ordinary narrative and extra special narrative. It's in a class by itself. It's quite unusual. And not to recognize that is from reading everything else in Genesis and everything else in the narrative books of the Old Testament, and then set that over against the style of Genesis 1, there are similarities. They're both prose narrative, but Genesis 1 is clearly exalted prose narrative. And so it's going to have more of what you might call figurative elements. But to say they're figurative doesn't mean that they're non-historical, and that seems to be, that's a problem with that kind of opposition, history versus poetry. It's not useful. You see, does that make sense to you?
Well, the one about Psalms makes a lot of sense because I know it has both.
Yeah.
You can't just say all of the Psalms are
Right.
poetry.
See, what we tend to do is in the Lord of the Rings. Are you familiar with the Lord of the Rings? In the first volume, in the chapter "A Conspiracy Unmasked," Frodo has just learned that Merry and Pippin have had Sam spying on him, and they've declared their intention of going with Frodo in his journey out of the Shire. And Pippin, I believe it is having a bath and is singing, we must away, ere break of day." And Frodo says to him, "Well, if you really mean to be away before the break of day, we've got a lot to do." And Pippin says, "Oh, that was only poetry. Do you really mean to be away before the break of day?" And so we tend to say only poetry. And that's part of our problem. It's not the biblical authors.
One more question over here. Actually, maybe time for two.
When theology and science disagree, what do you recommend?
That was concise.
What you have to recognize is that both of them are interpretations. And so, first of all, you've got to explore what exactly is the disagreement and whether it is a real disagreement, what lies behind it, what's the reasoning process that leads to the various conclusions, and what aspects of it you need to evaluate. So I think that really it's just a matter of evaluating the whole reasoning process of both, because they're both interpretations.
As an Old Testament scholar, you hardly made any references to the New Testament at all, and it would seem that Romans 1 would be an
Yes.
obvious passage to make reference to in respect of evidence of design and creation pointing toward God. I wondered if you
Yes.
could maybe conclude with a comment on that.
Fair enough. In Romans chapter 1, Paul says about those who reject God, "For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." And I do read that as indicating that it's a normal human experience to observe the features of the world around us and to believe that this world must be the product of some greater being, some being greater, far greater than we are. And so I do believe that really is the seeds of a design type of argument. What's very interesting as well, and if I live long enough, I will put all of this in print, is how much of a piece this argument of Paul is with his Jewish predecessors. The book in the Deuterocanonicals called The Wisdom of Solomon has an argument very similar to this. Paul's younger contemporary, Josephus, also makes the same point, including talking about divine power that's recognizable in the creation. It also seems to correlate with philosophical trends going on in the pagan Greek world as well, especially amongst the Stoics. So that Paul is talking the language of this very common human experience of inferring design, not simply on the small scale. I can infer that this is a designed item, but inferring that this whole show is designed. And then really the point that we all ought to be drawing from that is, if it's designed, what was it designed for? And if we are designed, what were we designed for? And how will we respond to that? And that's religion.
Thank you, Dr. Collins.